All right, everyone, welcome to our third webinar in this series for Forage Month. We have made June Forage Month in Alabama so that we can inform our producers about forages and their role in the livestock industry in Alabama. There is a series of these. We had two last week, which are now posted at alabamaforages.com. You can see those there. Today's topic will be on managing legumes. And then we have a silage and baleage production webinar, which is on Thursday. We actually have a special webinar, which is part of our monthly series, which goes on throughout the year, which is our beef and forage webinar series that takes place on the second Wednesday of every month. Tomorrow, I'll have information on that. It will use a different Zoom link since it is a different webinar series. At the end of the presentation, I'll have information on that, but that will be on native warm season grasses and a graduate student that is doing some work with those. Next week, we'll have two topics on horse pasture management and making high quality hay. And then on to round out our month, we'll have talks on the economics of warm season forages and grazing management. Each of these, again, are at 10 o'clock on every Tuesday and Thursday in June. And if you're unable to attend, make sure to visit our recorded webinars. Just as some housekeeping, again, this is recorded, so I will post it to alabamaforages.com by the end of the week, along with all of our other webinars. I do have all participants muted to reduce on background noise since this is recorded, but I will unmute you at the end of the webinar in order for you to be able to ask any questions. There's also a chat feature in Zoom that you can chat questions as well, or email me. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. So let's get into our presentation. Today's topic is legumes, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I am Leanne Dillard, the Forage Extension Specialist for Alabama, located at Auburn University. And I will be giving this today kind of an overview of why we would want legumes in our system and some challenges of trying to get legumes to persist in our system. So the good. Simply by adding another species, be it a legume or a grass, into our forage mixture, we're able to typically increase our forage yield. This is because a lot of the time with our different forage grasses, they're going to peak at different months. They're going to peak their production at different months, which increases our overall forage yield. Here's an example of some data from overseeding Bahia grass with crimson clover and at different nitrogen fertilization rates. So when we looked at no nitrogen application in this system, we saw that without clover, we were getting about 2,000 pounds of dry matter, and this is across the season. This is accumulated total in the Bahia grass system. Just by simply adding crimson clover, we were able to increase that about fourfold to a little over 7,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. That is partly just the addition of the clover. Crimson clover is a very productive clover. Also, there is, and I will get into this a little bit more later, there is some transfer of nitrogen into the system from the legume, which would also increase the productivity of the Bahia grass. Now, as we add nitrogen to our system, and we max out at about 200 pounds of nitrogen application rate, you see there still is a benefit of adding the crimson clover. Now it's only about twofold. So we have about 8,000 pounds of dry matter versus 1,600. But even at that rate, we're still able to see an increase in our forage production and forage yield simply by adding crimson clover in this system. This is some data out of the Piedmont of Georgia. It's a few years old, but still holds very true till today, looking at a variety of different forage species. And in this study, they were looking at the early season production versus the total season production, and also the variability from year to year in this production. So for all systems, they saw that for the most part, most production is going to happen late in the spring, so after March 31st. And when you looked at your year-to-year comparison, you see that for the most part, all of these clovers are going to be very variable in their production early in the spring. Now, this is the Piedmont, so we're talking about an area that would be, you know, Birmingham to Auburn. And, you know, we do get some late winters there, which is probably why they're seeing all the variability. Now, when you looked at your total forage yield over the season, for the most of the species, it actually was moderate to low, especially crimson clover. I just mentioned that's one of our higher producing clover options. And arrowleaf and red clover also, their variability is quite is only moderate. Now, when you look at some of our lesser used clovers like berseem and subterranean, you see they do have quite a bit of high variability, which is why you don't see those clovers used as often. So this is the effect of adding an annual clover to a coastal Bermuda grass field. And this data is, as you see, is several years old, but still holds, again, very true till today. And this is looking at crimson and arrowleaf, both with 200 pounds of nitrogen applied, no clover with nitrogen applied, and then no clover and no nitrogen. So you see across these 4 years, the highest production system was either the crimson or the arrowleaf with the 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Bermuda grass is extremely responsive to nitrogen, so even though you're adding the fertilizer and the clover, you still see the added benefit just because Bermuda grass is so responsive. Now, also, if you think about the production of Bermuda grass versus crimson, you'll see that crimson and arrowleaf are going to be more productive late in the spring, probably before you're going to see much green up the Bermuda grass. So really a lot of that addition is going to also correlate into an extension of the grazing season by adding a month or two to earlier in the spring that you could graze compared to Bermuda grass alone. And when you compare those two systems compared to, excuse me, no clover with 200 pounds, you see that they're more productive in every single year. And then when you look at no clover and no nitrogen, that's obviously the least productive system. So it really goes to show no matter what kind of system you're using, whether you want to go for a low input, try to replace some of that nitrogen fertilizer with the clover, or you still are looking for a high input system where you're still going to be adding a lot of nitrogen to the system, you still see benefits just on the yield side. So not only do you get an increase in forage yield, you also see an increase in forage quality. So again, this is going back to some coastal Bermuda grass, and this study very just quickly showed the difference between coastal plus 100 pounds of nitrogen versus coastal and various legumes. Now this is the average over several different legumes. I just wanted to kind of put the point out there. You saw the same average yield with 100 pounds of nitrogen and a legume with no nitrogen. But you can see the increase in crude protein was anywhere from 1 to 4% compared to coastal alone. And for a lot of classes of livestock we have, the coastal will be just fine. 9% crude protein is good for our dry cows and some of our horse systems. But if you're looking at putting some weight on some calves, increasing your weaning weight, or you're looking at doing some stockering or some finishing systems in a warm season system, the addition of a legume definitely can increase your quality. So this is a study that I did as part of my master's research over in the Black Belt, where the soils are quite unique for the state of Alabama. I'm going to talk a lot about acidic soils and the problems with growing clovers. That's not as much of an issue in the Black Belt where they're have more basic soils. So in this study, we were looking at Johnson grass with and without Ladina clover. And typically with Johnson grass, a lot of places we're going to consider it a weed. In the Black Belt, it's a pretty, one of the few things that can grow quite prolifically. So it's actually seen as quite a good thing. It is a lot more erect in growth habit compared to, say, Bermuda grass, which is you're going to see a lot of Ladino clover, which is a more prostrate growth habit clover in a Bermuda grass system. So I will say that, and I don't have the data here, just from visual inspection, there was 10% or less of clover in these stands, just because the growth habits and the growth characteristics of these forages really didn't match up very well. So even having said that, you can see that no matter which system, whether it was commercial fertilizer, broiler litter on a nitrogen basis, or broiler litter on a phosphorus basis, supplemented with commercial fertilizer, you saw about 1% increase when you added the clover to the system. And if, as you go back to the Bermuda grass, the slide before, when you are able to have two grasses or two plants that are more kind of fit better in their growth habits, you're able to increase that maybe up to 4% crude protein difference with the addition of clover. So going back to our livestock needs, when we look on the continuum of forages and what their average quality is, we see our warm season perennial grasses tend to be our least quality. These are going to be our Bermuda grasses, our Johnson grass, Bahia grass, Dallas grass. We're really going to rely on them in the summer. We really need them, but they're not going to be very high quality. They're going to get mature really fast and tend to have a lower protein content. So here on the y-axis, we have digestibility, or TDN. So on average, our warm season perennial grasses are about 50 to 53% TDN. The range depends on species and variety, but in general. When we look at our next category, it's going to be cool season perennial grasses. The most common, which is going to be tall fescue, which is kind of on the lower end of that spectrum. For those of you in extreme North Alabama, that's going to be possibly orchard grass, which is extremely palatable and extremely nutritious. So you can see there the range is a little bit higher. You're talking about 50 to 70% TDN, averaging about 60 to 62. Our next category, which is slightly greater, is going to be cool season annual grasses. Wheat, oat, annual ryegrass, our brassicas. Those forages are going to be a little bit better than our cool season perennial grasses, and typically a lot more productive as well. And then our highest category, which again is quite a large range, is going to be our legumes. So that's going to range from about 50% or 53% TDN all the way to pushing 80% TDN. And on average, you're talking about almost 70. So those are the most highly nutritious forages that we have. Now, when we overlay our livestock needs, we see that for a dry pregnant cow that's just gaining condition, as I mentioned earlier, our warm season perennial system and our cool season perennial system are perfect. They meet the demands of that animal and are able to keep her gaining condition until parturition. Now, when we look at some of our higher need classes of livestock, say like a 450-pound steer gaining about 1.5 pounds average daily gain, you can see his needs are closer to 65%, 67%, and our warm season perennial grasses are not going to meet that. And I would actually argue this is a rather small requirement. If we look at a system where in some of our systems we want our stockers gaining 2.5 to 3 pounds a day, that would be even higher, obviously. And if you look at dairy cattle, and this would be a dairy cow on pasture, so she's only producing about 50 pounds of milk per day on average throughout her lactation, she's only going to be able to meet her demand by legumes. And that's why alfalfa is so popularly used in dairy for that system. But as we just talked about, you can see that if you have an animal, say our steer here, and we want to use warm season perennial grasses, by adding some of these legumes, we will be able to get that quality up, that TDN up to where it needs to be for that animal, which is how we can utilize legumes in that system. So also, and I've kind of alluded to this several times, but there is the possibility of free nitrogen fertilizer. And I put free in quotes because nothing is free, right? There's always a cost to it. But legumes do fix nitrogen. And nitrogen fertilization is typically 20 to 40% of our grass production costs. It's very expensive. It's also, obviously, you have to drive a tractor, put it out, so there is fuel and labor costs there as well. So it does consume a lot of our production costs in pasture. Now, these are averages, so it's very difficult to actually measure exactly how much nitrogen is being returned into a system. But these are some averages, and again, it depends on your management. Are you using the legume as a green manure? or are you grazing it and returning it? Are you haying it? So, but these are just to give you some relatively large range values. So our most productive system for returning nitrogen is going to be alfalfa at 200 to 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Of that, as it degrades, it is able to put that some into a grass. And I'm going to talk about alfalfa specifically towards the end of the presentation just to give you some information on that. Our perennial system, so our red clovers and our white clovers, are going to produce a little bit less. They're not as productive as alfalfa. So you're talking about 100, 150, maybe 200 pounds of nitrogen returned in those systems. And annual clovers are going to produce the least 50 to 150. There's also more costs there because it does, you do have to establish those every year. But if you look at the nitrogen value, if say nitrogen was 45 cents a pound, you can see the savings could be anywhere from $23 per acre to $135 an acre. So if you're considering adding legumes to your system, that could cover the cost of seed just as a way to reduce nitrogen fertilization. Maybe not eliminate it completely, but at least reduce the amount you have to apply. So also, legumes are a time-release nitrogen. Much like, say, poultry litter, for those of you familiar with that, you know that you get some nitrogen immediately, but you also get some nitrogen within the next up to 6 months after a broiler litter application. The same with legumes. The nitrogen is kind of captured into the plant tissues. So as the roots degrade in the soil, that's when you're going to get the release of nitrogen, which is kind of nice because instead of just being a big flush and then, you know, not have much nitrogen later in the season, they're going to get a little bit throughout the year, which is what we like to see, especially in grazing systems where they're going to have some continuous grazing pressure throughout the season. So another thing that I kind of enjoy about legumes is that they have typically very pretty flowers, which is good at attracting beneficial pollinators. So if you are in an orchard system or a row crop system as well as beef cattle, it is a way to help attract some pollinators into those systems. Also, as many of us these days, as we're in production systems, either just like it aesthetically to have wildlife there, or are looking for ways of marketing, which we can market to our clientele that this is something that is wildlife friendly. So that is another kind of benefit of putting them in your system. So all of this kind of leads to increased animal gains. So if we look at, we have increased forage available, we have increased forage quality, all of this is going to be able to lead to increased animal gains. And when it comes down to it, whether you're in a dairy system, a beef system, goat, sheep, what have you, for the most part, that's how we're going to get paid, is either putting more milk out, which would be, through a more productive system, or by making a larger animal. So many people are aware of this, and clovers are really popular and get in a good name, especially in the northern part of the state, as a way of diluting toxins from tall fescue. And this is a really quick example. It's old, but it's used all the time, of Kentucky 31, which is our toxic endophyte tall fescue, with 150 pounds of nitrogen compared to Kentucky 31 with white clover. And this was in a stalker system. I believe it was here in Alabama. And you can see with no clover, the animals were gaining about 1.1 pounds per day. When you just added the clover and then added no nitrogen to the system, that was more like 1.5 pounds per day. Still low for our system of what we like to see, but it kind of comes from two parts here. Yes, the animals are able to select for non-endophyte infected plants, the clover, so that does dilute the toxin, but also it's of higher quality. So the animals are also able to eat more high quality food and thus gain more. So it's kind of a twofold of that works. But a lot of people don't realize that it's not just in endophyte infected systems or toxic endophyte infected systems that this works. So this is another study that was done about 10 years ago in Eatonton, Georgia, which is in the Piedmont in central Georgia. that looked at endophyte, toxic endophyte infected, which is E+, novel endophyte, so like a max Q type forage that is going to have an endophyte but not be toxic, and then the addition of white clover. So when they looked at the difference between toxic endophyte, so Kentucky 31 versus novel endophyte, they saw an increase in average daily gain from 1.1 to 1.83 right here, which correlated into an increase in gain per acre, which is how I like to think of things. I can put a ton of weight on an animal if I reduce my stocking rate, but that's going to still affect my gain per acre. So if I can positively affect my gain per acre, I'm actually making forward progress. So here we're talking about a difference in 60 pounds per acre difference. And you can see that very quickly, especially if cattle prices are up, that makes a huge difference. Or even if cattle prices are down, that could be the difference between you breaking even or going into the red. Now, when they looked at the endophyte infected and white clover versus just endophyte infected, you see that there was 1.1 versus 1.6, so not quite as high as the endophyte free, but still an increase in gain. But interestingly enough, you saw a huge increase in average daily gain and gain per acre when you added a clover to the novel endophyte. So when you take out the effects of the toxin of fescue toxicosis and just look at fescue versus fescue and clover, you had almost a difference in 1 pound per head per day, which equaled almost about 70 to 80 pounds of gain per acre. And when you compare this system, so the novel endophyte with white clover compared to just endophyte infected, you are increasing about 125. You are doubling your gain per acre by doing that. So you can see that there is a benefit in Kentucky in 31 systems, but also just in any system. So along with that, we're a big cow-calf state. Another issue is conception rates. So, and this is overseeding in coastal Bermuda grass. So again, this is a non-fescue, a non-Kentucky 31 system. So there's no effects of the toxin. So this is just looking at clover versus not clover. So when you added in a rye with arrowleaf and crimson clover, arrowleaf and crimson clovers, ryegrass and none, you saw the two systems with the highest amount of grazing days and the highest cow average daily gain and calf average daily gain were the systems with the clovers, either with the rye and crimson and arrowleaf clovers or the arrowleaf and crimson clovers alone. So also you can see the system here had no nitrogen applied and had the highest cow average daily gain and tied for the highest calf average daily gain. It did have a lower grazing days because the rye here is going to add on some grazing days there. You can see they started grazing about 3 months later in this system, or 2 months later, which is where that difference comes in. But compared to ryegrass alone or no addition, so just coastal Bermuda grass, you can see that it was the lowest productive system. So now that I've told you all the good things and why you should use legumes, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up some things that can make using legumes challenging and why many of us actually don't end up having legumes in our system. So establishment of legumes. So prior to planting, it's important to get your field as weed-free as possible. This is because there are not, to date, any herbicides that are rated to use in clovers and legumes, unless you have Roundup Ready alfalfa, that you can use to control broadleaf weeds, because legumes are broadleafs. There is some ways of using a lower rate, but I'm not going to get into that in this presentation. Also, you need to pay attention to previous herbicide applications, and I'll get into this a little bit more in just a second, because there can be soil residual effects. It's very important to soil test as well as controlling the residue that's already there, because legumes, especially when planting them in a warm season perennial system, they're going to have a hard time competing with the grass. So it's important to give them the upper hand and control the residue that's there. They're also very small seeds, so any amount of shading from residue can affect their germination. So you want to no-till drill them in mid-October or after forage is dormant, depending on where you are in the state, making sure that you get the proper depth. Again, very small seeds. Southern forages is a great option of looking at what options you have or what the proper seeding depth is. Clovers, especially annual clovers, do really well in broadcasting, especially in the fall. If you're going to broadcast perennials, wait until late winter. You want to give them the best chance possible and you want to wait kind of until that late winter, early spring. So you can broadcast them prior to grazing an existing sod, and that will allow the livestock to tread in the seed as they graze. Again, increasing our soil to seed contact without planting too deep. It's a very, very important balance. So post-planting, scouting for insects as we would with any of our forages, and managing our grass competition, which is a real struggle, getting that balance of managing for both the legume and the grass. They have different growth habits, they have different fertilization needs, so managing that can be quite difficult. So in regards to soil fertility, again, it's very important to soil test because it's crucial to establish, because unlike grasses, legumes are very sensitive to pH. In general, we recommend a pH of 6 to 6.5, which in some places in Alabama can be quite, especially those with neglected soils, can be quite difficult because inherently our soils are below 5 pH. So it may take 6 months, a year, or a year and a half to get your pH where it's high enough in order to support legume growth. Also, phosphorus and potassium are extremely important, just like in our grasses, but even more so, legumes have a higher phosphorus requirement than our grasses. So when we look at our pH, again, like I said, we tend to say 6 to 6.5, but it is dependent on your forages. Again, if you're in the black belt, your pH is going to be closer to 7 to 7.5, so not as much of a concern there. Alfalfa, which is the queen of forages, and she gets that name for a variety of reasons. One, because it is such a great forage, but two, because she's a bit of a diva and does have, is difficult to manage, very high input system, but rewarding as well. Perennial peanut, for those of you in the extreme southern parts of Alabama, is a little more tolerant of pH and can go, again, though you see that sweet spot right in the middle at 6 to 6.5. Now, when we look at our clovers, again, 6 to 6.5, pushing 7. The one exception to this would be our annual medics, which we see a lot of them in the black belt because they really need a pH over 7. Hairy vetch and Sericea lespedeza are two that can handle a little more variety in their pH. So especially with hairy vetch, if you are in a system where your pH is lower, it might be an option to plant for a year or two while you're working on your pH before planting clover. So there's a lot of discussion on what is the best method to establish clover, either drilling or broadcasting. I always suggest drilling when at all possible because it allows you to put a more uniform seeding rate compared to broadcasting, and also increases your soil contact. As I've mentioned several times, though, you do have to be very particular about your seeding depth, especially if you're in uneven terrain. You want to make sure that your drill is not going too deep in areas or too shallow in other areas. Or actually, it's better to be too shallow than too deep, because you'll see as you go across the field that in those areas where the drill is dipped down, you won't get any germination. This study, I believe it was out of Arkansas, actually showed that in a ryegrass, white clover, crimson clover system, it did not, the gain per acre was the same, no matter how the seeding method was established. So if you have access to a drill, or you're going to be renting a drill to plant in some other forages, it definitely can be used. Make sure you use your small seed box when using it. There is a small seed box for legumes on most drills. If not, broadcasting is perfectly acceptable as well. So those are the kinds of, typical kind of difficult management things that we have to look out for, as we would in our grasses as well. But unfortunately, there are some, it does get to the ugly. So I tried to put a really pretty picture here of some flowering alfalfa that was taken in South Georgia to kind of, help us with the ugly. But what is the largest challenge we face in putting legumes into our system? And that's going to be weed control. So legume presence severely limits the use of broadleaf herbicides. Notably graze-on necks, or any of the graze-ons, which I think are really popular because they're very easy to use. They cover a whole gamut of things in our system, and they're very effective. But unfortunately, they do harm our legumes. So first, choose a field where weed pressure is minimal and start incorporating legumes into your system. But also be aware of herbicide residual when establishing legumes. So this is a label I took off graze-on necks, and this is not me picking on graze-on. Graze-on is a great product. Graze-on necks is a great product. They have their use. But just to show you, I think a lot of people don't realize how some of these herbicides have lasting effects. So the goal here is to show you, if you've been using some of these, make sure you're aware of it so that you don't try to establish legumes before the wait period is over. So this is coming directly from the label of graze-on necks, and it says here, seeding legumes. Do not plant forage legumes until a soil bioassay has been conducted to determine if aminopyrrolide residues remaining in the soil will adversely affect the legume establishment. So typically we say with a graze-on next, you're talking 12 to 18 months. Most people are not going to do a soil bioassay, even though that's what the label says. But we typically say 12 to 18 months if you look at the literature. But obviously always follow label directions and do what they say, because the label is the law, and we want to make sure we follow that correctly. So also another kind of ugly aspect of this is, what clover should I pick? Going through different species, different varieties, it can always be very confusing. And there's a lot of factors that have to be taken into account. So what's the best forage? So for warm season perennial grasses, so our Bermuda grass, our Bahia grass, annual cool season clovers complement this really well. A lot of you, especially if you're in South Alabama, are probably already overseasing with at least annual ryegrass, because you need some forage during the winter months, because there's not a perennial cool season we can use down there. I would suggest throwing in some clover in there as well. I personally really like crimson clover because it's pretty robust and can take a little bit of abuse compared to some of our other clovers. So if you are able to get a really good stand of crimson clover and you're wanting to look at other legumes, it's a really good stepping off point. It's also very productive. So if seasonal production is desired, crimson offers the earliest availability compared to red clover and some others. Also, in case you are not aware, red clover in South Alabama will not act as a perennial, but will be an annual, so you'll still have to replant it every year. So our planting dates are going to be mid-September through October, just like we suggest for our annual ryegrass. Again, they can be planted at the same time. Also, if you're going to be putting in a small grain into that overseeded system, also just throw this in a small seed box when you plant. We are doing some research at E.B. Smith and Wiregrass experiment station. So E.B. Smith's here in central Alabama, and Wiregrass is towards Dothan, where we're looking at some different cool season mixtures that include a small grain ryegrass and a clover. So there'll be more information on this as we move forward in the next several years to give you an idea of some of these novel varieties that we have available. So our adapted species in Alabama, we have arrowleaf clover, which is going to be good in the Piedmont and the coastal plain. Ball clover, you could use that in the southern mountain region through the Piedmont and the coastal plain as well. Crimson clover, typically Piedmont and coastal plain. You'll see it in the mountain region as well, but we typically suggest it in the further southern locales. Hairy vetch Red clover, white clover, and alfalfa can be used throughout the state. With each of these, there are different varieties that are going to work better in different parts of the state. So it's important to work with your seed dealer to make sure you're getting a variety that's appropriate to your geographical location as well as your soil type. So what things should you consider when selecting a clover species? Your geographic region. So whether you're in the Tennessee Valley, Sand Mountain, Ridge and Valley, Piedmont, Black Belt or Coastal Plain, Upper Coastal Plain, there's, I think more than 7 different geographic regions in the state, but due to differences in climate, but also soil type, some southern Alabama has more sandy soils. Northeast Alabama is going to have a very heavy clay soil, and then Black Belt's going to have the vertisoil, the shrinkswell clays. So it's important to make sure we meet those considerations. Soil drainage. So again, especially in these heavier soils, we want to make sure that we're in an area that's going to drain well and doesn't hold much water so that we can get proper establishment. Soil fertility, coming back to that, again, making sure our pH is right, also that our phosphorus and potassium are at levels that will support proper growth. Our forage distribution, again, I kind of hinted at this with the Johnson grass, but making sure what you're planting clover into is something that's going to be complementary to the clovers. If you use different forages that can compete with each other, you're probably not going to see great production in either one. So you want to make sure you're in a system that's going to complement. And that's kind of where our agents, our regional agents, as well as myself, come in to help you make that forage plan for year-round grazing. Also, companion species, I just kind of hit on that. Grazing management. Some of these clovers and legumes are going to be tolerant of overgrazing, especially like white clover is prostrate growing, so it's able to tolerate that. But some of our other clovers are not as tolerant, so they can only really be used effectively in rotational grazing. So making sure you keep that in mind as well. Annual versus perennial, again, this could be dependent on where you are. Like red clover is going to be a perennial in the north part of the state, but an annual in the southern part of the state. So making sure in your system, what is it that you want to benefit? Are you okay with planting every year, or do you want something that's going to last longer? So moving into alfalfa. Alfalfa, we don't hear about it much in terms of planting in the southeast, but that's changing. We do see it increasingly interseeded into Bermuda grass, especially in Piedmont and coastal plain regions. There's a lot of work been doing this in Georgia. We're doing quite a bit of research. Dr. Mullenix, our beef cattle extension specialist, is doing a lot of work of this in Alabama because it complements Bermuda grass very well. It grows during times when Bermuda grass is not growing, and then when the alfalfa goes dormant, you have Bermuda grass, which is growing well. So it makes a pretty good system. It dramatically improves your forage quality, as with any legume, but alfalfa is extremely productive, so you're going to see a higher percentage of legume in those stands. It's excellent combination of summer quality and quantity. It gives you a long grazing season, so April through September. Animal gains have been seen of 2 to 3 pounds per day, with a stocking rate of 1.5 to 3 head per acre. It is extremely drought tolerant. Out west, they grow a lot of dryland alfalfa, so it is in a world where we're going to be moving towards more dry summers, most likely. It can be a very useful system. So it does have high fertility requirements. As I mentioned, remember, it's the queen, not just because it's great and high quality, but also because she's a diva. Potassium or potash is critical. It is recycled under grazing, but in hay systems is important to keep our potassium very high. That's also the case with Bermuda grass. If you're in Bermuda grass hay production, you know potassium is extremely important. So you can imagine in these systems together, it's going to be even more vital. Again, pH should be 6 to 6.5. It is excellent for corn rotations in a sod-based rotation. The grazing tolerant varieties are available. There are Roundup ready varieties available as well. And then if you're grazing, you want to give it 25 to 28 day rest period to ensure persistence and quality, because it is a perennial. We want to make sure that you get return on your investment. So we want to, our goal would be to get a stand that's going to last 4 to 5 years. So some other legumes that we don't hear too much about, but there are out there and you could be used this time of year especially, would be warm season legumes. Annuals would include cowpea. You may be familiar with that as black-eyed pea. It's the same species. Annual lespedeza, which is an annual cousin to Sericea lespedeza. Forage soybeans and sun hemp. Perennial options are Sericea lespedeza, perennial peanut for those of you in extreme South Alabama, and sandfoin, one that's, again, not heard of very much but is out there. So how to keep clovers in your pastures. Soil test and follow recommendation. We suggest soil testing in a graze system every 2 years and a hay system every year. Apply nitrogen applications will favor grasses in any mix, so keep nitrogen as minimal as possible to help keep that balance. You can spot spray or mechanically weed control when weeds do occur. Good grazing management will give you the most benefits. White and subterranean clovers can reduce shading from undergrazing, white and subclover. Okay. Red and early season crimson and airleaf clovers avoid overgrazing. So with some of our clovers, we want to make sure that, and I'll have a picture of here in just a second, we want to make sure that if they're low growing, we open the canopy so they can grow. So we want to have, utilize our forage maximum to the maximum extent. But in some of our other clovers, our annual clovers, typically we're going to want to avoid overgrazing because they're more erect growing and will not be able to regrow as well. Plus, only plant what you can manage. With any change in forage system, we suggest trying this out, on a few acres you have that kind of meet the optimal conditions for planting before you plant your entire farm in anything, and just see, kind of play with it for a few years, see how you like it, and kind of play with different varieties and different species. So here's a picture of how that grazing can work. You see in this picture here, say this was a fescue white clover system. We want to make sure our fescue gets grazed down so that our white clover is able to come out. Where you see here, this is undergrazed and it's really shading out our clover. So with that, I will end today's topic. For those of you who are not already on our e-newsletter, make sure you sign up at alabamaforages.com to get information on these webinars. I try to send out an update once a month on events that we are planning, as well as any publications or up-to-date information on weeds or pests. Also, alabamaforages.com has all of our information on all of our publications that you can go visit there.